Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Bradley, and I am the co-director of DNA Studies here at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. Our website is genealogicalstudies.com, and this is the September virtual meeting for the DNA group. Today, I want to start a new sort of strand of our virtual sessions, which is to discuss some historical cases that have been solved using DNA or partly by DNA and the technology surrounding it. Now, I expect that many of you will know the stories that I'm going to talk about, but it's interesting to look at them from a DNA perspective, which maybe you haven't done before. So this for me is a real merging of two things I'm very interested in. My primary degree, my undergraduate degree, was in Russian language and history. So I know a lot about the Romanov family, and this is the last royal family of Russia. The Tsar Nikolai II is there with his wife Alexandra and their daughters Olga, Maria, Tatiana, and Anastasia, and their son Alexei. And they were murdered by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg in 1918 after the Russian Revolution the previous year, and their bodies were dumped in a mineshaft. And Russia became the Soviet Union, and the world moved on. Initially, it was believed that the Tsarina and her children had survived, and that it was only the Tsar who'd been executed. And it suited the Bolsheviks to allow those rumors to circulate. But by 1926, it was made public that the whole family, plus 4 servants, were all killed at the same time in 1918. But what was not known was what had happened to the family's bodies, and that was known for many decades. And of course, you can see why in the Soviet Union's eyes, they didn't want to have the place of their burial known. It might create a place of pilgrimage, and they wanted to avoid that. But people were always interested in what had happened to them, understandably. And a geologist called Alexander Avdonin had an interest in what had happened to the Romanovs. And over the years, he collected information, often not writing it down, just orally being able to talk to someone whose husband had been a prison guard or things like that, because this was not something that was encouraged. And you have to remember that in the Soviet Union, people could be spying on you and reporting on you. But he was interested and he collected information, and people in Yekaterinburg, which had been renamed Smolensk in the Soviet Union, knew that he was the guy who wanted to know the information. And it culminated in him secretly excavating a burial site in 1979 with the aid of a filmmaker who was called Gaily Rubyov. I'm not saying that right. And they kept this information a secret for a decade because they were worried. They didn't know what would happen. But eventually, the filmmaker decided to spill the beans, and the information was out. And once the Soviet Union broke up, an official excavation took place in 1991. It was not done under anything like proper scientific conditions. They used bulldozers. That's all you need to know about how efficient it was. But it became very quickly apparent when they identified the bodies that 2 of them were missing. And it was said to be either Maria or Anastasia and Alexei the Tsarevich. Now, let's discuss how they actually determined that the bodies were the Romanovs. Now, the first thing to say is that there was always a presumption that it was them, which is, I suppose, a scientific bias. But they knew they were looking for a group. They knew how many men, how many women, how many of them were adults, how many of them would not be adults. And there wasn't any other stories of people being murdered in such a way and then their bodies not being buried in a regular fashion in a cemetery. So there was always a presumption that this was them, but they still had to prove it. And this is where DNA testing came in, which was in the early 90s a very nascent science. The skeleton remains were in very poor condition. So there was a lot of work to be done in figuring out whose bones were whose and which bones went with which skeleton. And they knew that they could use familial DNA matching to determine that 5 sets of remains related to each other, as in that 2 of the skeletons were the parents of 3 of the younger skeletons. And they did this by looking at STRs, short tandem repeats. Um, Anthropologists could also help with this. They could also determine the gender and the approximate ages from the shape of the bones, how fused the vertebrae were, which doesn't happen until certain points in your life, and the dental work. And some of the dental work was very extensive and actually was done with platinum. So they were able to tell, okay, these people were wealthy, high status people. You don't have platinum dental work if you're ordinary. But in this era, we didn't yet have the autosomal DNA that we use today as another confirmation, and many of the Romanovs' close family were dead. But mitochondrial DNA was available. So just as a reminder, what's mitochondrial DNA? Mitochondrial DNA travels through female line, so your mother's line. And therefore, because we knew that the Tsarina was going to be the mother was the mother of 5 children, 4 or 3 of whom were going to be here, they should all have matching mitochondrial DNA. And which they did. So they were able to say, okay, this is a mother and children group. And then the next step was to identify a candidate from that same mitochondrial DNA line for comparison. So, step forward, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was Queen Elizabeth II's consort in Britain. Prince Philip was actually a prince of Denmark and Greece. You wouldn't think it by looking at him, but he was. And that's because of a complicated thing where the Greek royal family were all died out at one point, and then members of the Danish royal family who were distantly related to them were invited to become the king of Greece, which later on, of course, didn't exist. The monarchy in Greece was done away with. But Prince Philip was, if we look here at this line, here's Prince Philip. This is his mother Alice of Battenberg. And her mother, so his granny, was a Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, so a German princess. And actually, her grandmother was Queen Victoria of Britain. So Prince Philip, actually a descendant of Queen Victoria in the mitochondrial line. And of course, Queen Elizabeth, his wife, was also a descendant of Queen Victoria, but not in the mitochondrial line. But very important here is this lady who is Queen Victoria's granddaughter via her daughter Alice, and Victoria's sister. And this is giving her original name, which is Alex of Hesse by Rhine. And when she married Tsar Nikolai II, she took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna and converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, which was required to be a member of the Russian royal family. And so she was always known as Alexandra after that, but she was the Tsarina. So if you look at it like this, even though he would never have met her, Prince Philip was the great nephew of the Tsarina. So therefore, he would have the same mitochondrial DNA, which is Queen Victoria's mitochondrial DNA. So he was a viable candidate, and therefore he was willing to give a sample, which was by no means guaranteed when they approached him. And so that was one of the reasons why they chose a laboratory in the UK called Aldermaston. And that because they felt, oh, well, he'd be more likely to do it if it's a UK laboratory than an American one. This laboratory actually did the work for free for the good of science, even though it would have cost well over $100,000 in that era to identify 9 sets of remains. There were some noses out of joint in the USA. When because it was various teams vying for this work, because it's a huge deal. It's very prestigious, and everyone wanted to know the answer to it. So just pause for a second and think how far we've come in 30 years. The dearest commercial test that we might use for our DNA, excluding full genome testing, is the Big Y test that men can take. Costs about $400. You can routinely buy an autosomal DNA test for under $100 US. This work cost hundreds of thousands. So that's a huge technological leap in such a short time. So the analysis concluded that there was a match between Prince Philip's mitochondrial DNA and the mitochondrial DNA of the Tsarina and her 3 daughters, or the women that they expected to be her. And so that was a proof, the first proof that this was the right family. Now, there was significant dissent between the Russian team and the American team as to which of the daughters was missing. The Russians thought it was Marie or Maria, and the Americans said it was Anastasia. But everyone agreed that Alexei the Tsarevich was missing as well. He was the youngest. He was only 14. And we'll come on to him in a minute. But how did they then compare? Or sorry, how did they prove it was the Tsar? So we've got all these people that prove it's the Tsarina and the daughters, but how do we prove it's him? Now we're not just going by, oh well, it must be him because that's the rest of his family, and where else would he be? No, that's not good science. We need to know that it's him as well. We need a different DNA for him. There was actually a handkerchief in Japan that had his blood on it. He'd been on a before he became the Tsar, he'd been on a tour in Japan, and something had happened where he'd ended up cutting his hand, and they had the handkerchief that he put on his hand when to mop up the blood, and they had kept it. And they thought that they would be able to use that, but of course, the problem with contact is that many people had touched that handkerchief over the years, and you could no longer get a clear DNA profile from it. And it's something you might be able to do better today than what we're talking about in 1991. So it was contaminated essentially, and they couldn't use that. And then they said, "Oh, hang on, the Tsar." I've got a bigger tray here, of course. The Tsar had a living nephew. He was born in 1917, and he was by the early 90s pretty old, but he was living in Canada. And this is him here, Tikhon Kukilovsky. And they approached him, and he refused to participate. I read a bit about him, and it seems like he was maybe a little paranoid as to the reasons why it was being done, and that he thought, oh, maybe it would prove that he wasn't a Romanov, which wasn't in doubt. So he would have had the right mitochondrial DNA to match the Tsar, but he didn't. So here's the Tsar here, Nikolai. And Tikhon was the son of Nikolai's sister Olga, so that would have worked. But no, he wasn't on for it, so they had to consider something else. So they then went on to the mitochondrial DNA of other people who would match, and they went back to this lady here who was the Queen of Denmark, Louisa of Hesse-Kassel, and she is a grandmother of Nikolai. You can see there. So his mother is Princess Dagmar of Denmark, and then her mother was Louisa, and then we come on to a couple of other people who are connected, and so they actually got two people to they got two different people who had an unbroken line back to this Louisa. The first one was this lady here, Xenia Nikolaevna Sheremetyeva, who was a great granddaughter of the Grand Duchess Xenia, who was Nikolai's sister. So she, her mother. So that's unbroken female line there. And then we got this guy here who was James Carnegie, the third Duke of Fife, so a Scottish aristocrat. And his mother goes back to Alexandra of Denmark and back to Louisa as well. So two mitochondrial lines. Now this is where it gets interesting. The results revealed that the Tsar had a heteroplasmy. Now what's that? Just as a reminder, it's the presence of more than one mitochondrial DNA sequence in a cell or a person. As in where the mitochondrial DNA has mutated, and both the original and the mutated sequence can be detected in an individual. Now, one of the mtDNA sequences matched exactly, and one of them differed by a single base in the skeleton that they believed to be the Tsar, and that of the DNA of the Countess and the Duke. Now, at that stage, they didn't have a huge amount of information about this sort of thing, but the scientists understood that that was a non-significant discrepancy. But they were worried that when it came out, people who didn't understand this stuff would go, oh, that means it's not right, we're not going to have that. However, it was enough for them to go, yes, this is the Tsar. Now, later on, what they also did was that the Tsar had a younger brother who died of typhoid or TB or something like that long before Nikolai died. And but he was buried in, they knew where his body was. He was buried, with all the pomp and circumstance as a Grand Duke of Russia would have been when he died in the 1890s. And they later on actually exhumed his body. And what that actually, his name was Georgi, and his matched the Tsar's exactly, and he also had the same heteroplasmy. So they were happy then that, okay, this is a mutation that had happened in that family, and there's nothing to worry about here. It's definitely who he was, because his body was never in doubt. They always knew what person was. So that fully confirmed that the Romanovs were indeed the remains that were found. And of course, the staff members were also fully identified in this process, but I haven't actually seen any scientific evidence. There's a famous paper in Nature, the first one that identifies the family, and then there's a follow-up one later. But I haven't seen any scientific work done comparing the DNA of the staff members to any descendants of their respective families. So it seems like in their case, they did just go, well, we know these people were with them, and we can tell, this one's a man, this one's a woman, so this must be her, and so on. It's a little bit less precise, but still not any doubt really when you know who the rest of them are. But it does show perhaps a bias. So we're going to identify the important people, but the less important people are not so. We don't need to bother with the full verification with them. So let's come on to Anna Anderson. You knew I was going to get to her. So Anna Anderson was a woman who claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia. She first started saying she was Anastasia in 1922 when she was in a mental health facility in Berlin, in Germany. Now, many members of the Russian royal family said straight away she was an imposter, and a few of them actually even went to meet her, but a couple of them thought she was her, and you can understand, this is so sad. These people know that their family have been killed in awful circumstances, and of course you would wish that maybe one of them survived, maybe one of them escaped and hid away and then changed her identity. Of course you would hope that. And a couple of people were taken in by her. But famously, if I just nip back to this slide for a second, Nikolai's mother, she actually survived the Russian Revolution. She escaped, and she went to live in Denmark with her sister. She refused to meet Anna Anderson. She always said, "No way, I'm not having it. It's not her, and I'm not going to entertain it." Alexander, the Tsarina's brother, another Alexandra. Her brother was the Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, and he actually paid for a private investigation in 1927. And it may not have been done under the most salubrious of conditions, but they uncovered the possibility that it was most likely that she was a Polish national called Franziska Szankowska, and who was a woman who had a history of mental health problems. And members of her family, Franziska's family, actually did meet her, and a number of them said it's definitely her, but she denied it to their faces. She pretended not to know them. So she continued to claim she was Anastasia until she died in 1984. She went to live in America, and she married someone who was much younger than her. And she never had any children. Her body was cremated the day she died, which not at all suspicious, not at all. But by chance, a piece of her intestine had been stored in a hospital following a surgery she'd had in 1979. And ensued a large legal battle to get control of that sample and who actually was who was the person who would have control of it. She had no children, but there were members of her husband's family who were saying, no, it's ours. It was a huge legal battle that took nearly 2 years. And all kinds of people who had an oar in the game. There was an organization of Russian nobles who had survived, and they wanted to get control of it, and various other people for their own nefarious purposes, it has to be said. So eventually, the battle was done, and American laboratories tested the sample, and they extracted mitochondrial DNA from it, and they compared it to Prince Philip's mitochondrial DNA and the DNA from the bones, and there was no match. But then they also compared it to a great nephew of Francisca's, and it did match. So the evidence was that she was indeed the Polish woman that people had sometimes said she was. Now, further historical research later discovered that in an attempt to disguise the burial site of the family, 2 of the bodies had been removed and buried somewhere else. And the other grave was identified, and scientific analysis was carried out on the 2 sets of remains that were found at it. And 2 independent labs, one in the USA and one in Austria, confirmed that the pair were a brother and sister, and then they confirmed that they were the children of Nikolai and Alexandra. So they had at last found the 2 other bodies. And so that concluded the mystery. Sadly, none of the family or their staff survived the Apachev house in Yekaterinburg in 1918. And of course, DNA testing went on to be used in a multitude of other cases. I'm going to do some other case studies on these in the coming months as an occasional feature of our virtual meetings. We have a couple of minutes left for questions, but before I stop the recording, I want to thank you for coming to today's class, which was presented by the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. And you can find us at genealogicalstudies.com.